Well, I want to say good morning to everyone, all of our campuses. Wow, it is so great to be back with you. Are you ready for some good news? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. That in this crazy, polarized, strife-filled, hateful, even culture, you don't have to be caught up in all of that. You don't have to be stressed out, burned out, frustrated, angry, and caught up in the whole feud. There is a different role that you have as a child of God, and it is a peacemaker. I have wanted to many times say, no, I don't want to do this whole series. Is challenging. In many ways, the concepts we'll speak of are complex. But I think the way I can serve best as your pastor in a time of such a polarized culture is not to tell you what you ought to believe, certainly not what you ought to believe politically about all of those issues, but to help you see what the Spirit of God thinks about all this and how God's Spirit in you makes you different than everyone else, and how you can be used by God to bring peace rather than add to all of the strife. And I can't think of any better place to start such a series than in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 at verse 1, seeing the crowds, went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who went before you. And one of the great principles that we will just see throughout this is Paul's words in Romans 12. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. As much as it depends on you, live peaceably with everyone. On November 3rd of 1979, when my TV news father, Dave Wright, went to work, he had no idea that the routine coverage of a rally would be the evening's national news. Nor did he know that but for the grace of God, he could have lost his life that day. It was a rally of the Communist Workers' Party, CWP, that had assembled in the Morningside neighborhood of Greensboro and had planned to march to Greensboro City Hall, the seat of Guilford County. This rally did not carry with it the same peaceable spirit of some of the beautiful civil rights actions that had taken place earlier, most notably the famous sit-in at the Woolworth lunch counter, which bore such good fruit. They weren't following the kind of peaceable and powerful strategies of that civil rights movement that had been led by Martin Luther King Jr. But instead, there was vitriol even in the CWP's promotional flyers, one of which had said that in the Death to the Klan march, that they wanted to demonstrate even to the point of violence against the Klan. And so when Dad showed up that morning with his cameraman at the Morningside neighborhood, the CWP marchers and protesters were assembling, And not longer after they had assembled, a caravan of about 10 cars and a van began riding back and forth in front of them. It was Ku Klux Klan members and some members of the American Nazi group. And the CWP people began hurling insult towards the Klan, hitting their cars with pickets and throwing rocks. And then, unthinkably, the Klan members, many of them, went to the trunks of their cars and they pulled out rifles and handguns and they began shooting. And within seconds, a magna cum laude graduate of Duke had been slain. A head of pediatrics at a nearby hospital was killed. A Harvard Divinity School student was lying there dead soon afterwards. The young woman that was the president of the student body at Bennett College was killed. Another would die several days later from injuries sustained. Others were wounded, and it became known as the Greensboro Massacre. By the grace of God, none of the reporters were in the crossfire, and Dad lived to tell the story on the evening news. How sad that there's now a marker in that spot at the corner of Everett Street in Greensboro, marking such a thing that accomplished nothing. How quickly strife that's fueled by hate can escalate into destruction. Contrast it with one of my favorite stories that I heard after coming back from sabbatical and this week meeting with our coaches and hearing some of the stories and testimonies of good things the Lord has done. And one of my favorite stories was told by Pastor Barrett, who is campus pastor at our Union Cross campus, and told about an event that they held in his neighborhood where he and 3 other of our families at our Union Cross campus live, Weldon Village and Kernersville. And it was an event on the eve of Independence Day. It was a pre-4th of July celebration. And they had been meeting on Wednesday nights talking about saturating the community with the love of Christ. And they said, well, on July 3, why don't we just do some of this? And so they decided just to be a blessing to the entire neighborhood and to the whole community, invite friends, invite all the neighbors there in Weldon Village. And they just had a big time of it. 250 people came. Our own T.L. Limeberry had his legit cover band playing some tunes from the 70s and 80s, I think. T.L., if you're listening, I hope you did at least one Doobie Brothers tune for me. But they were playing music, and we had one of our own, Brent Babb, who is cooking up some food and barbecued chicken for everybody to partake. And the kids had a great time, big wet slide and the sprinklers going. And then they organized the kids into a bicycle parade. They let them parade around. And while they were, the band started playing the Star Spangled Banner while they're parading. And they couldn't get the parade to stop. The kids didn't want to stop biking around the neighborhood. And Barrett told me, he said, at first there were some, it seemed like in the neighborhood they were a little bit skeptical. I think people are wondering what kind of pyramid scheme selling thing is this going to be, or what's going to be. And all he did was he got up to the microphone one time and he said who he was, and he said, Renolda Church at Union Cross is pleased to be able to sponsor this event tonight. I hope you have a wonderful time. If you do happen to be looking for a church home, we'd love to have you come visit. And that was it. And so any skepticism eventually wore off into folks because they realized they were just being a great blessing to the neighborhood. But somewhere in the middle of an event, an angry woman who had lived not in the immediate neighborhood, but across a neighborhood across the way, very, very angry, came approaching the platform. And Barrett said it looked like she was going to go up and knock down a microphone or something. She was so angry. And so Pastor Barrett stepped up and she spun towards him. He said that she was so angry and there was a cloud of an aroma of alcohol about her. And she turned to him and said, to shut this blanking thing down and started screaming at the top of her lungs, every other word an expletive. And Barrett said, I thought she was going to hit me. I said, Barrett, what were you going to do? He said, I was just going to let her hit me. But right about that time, a woman who lived in the neighborhood but is not connected with our church came bolting forward towards the scene. And you might think, well, she's going to come up and complain too. While this lady is saying, my whole house foundation is blank and shaking across the street. And this woman came up and said, what seems to be the problem? And she was defending not only Barrett, but the whole event. And the woman said, well, who in the blank are you? And started talking to her like that. And next thing you know, this woman who's completely disconnected with our church, I don't know if she goes to church, I don't know if she's Christian, and she started taking the heat for us all. And next thing you know, Barrett said that this neighborly woman walked with the angry woman back across to the woman's house, far across another street, because the woman said, come here, what it looked like over there, and walked over there and spent 45 minutes with her. And everything improved. There's more to that story. But let me start with this. That when you think about being a peacemaker and to say, blessed are the peacemakers, that like all of the Beatitudes, it is not a list of Jesus saying, here are the laws, and if you will do this or be this, then you will receive this blessing. But instead, the way that Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount is by saying essentially, I want to describe for you what the blessed life looks like. So he is not saying if you will become a peacemaker, then you will be a child of God. No, there are very clear words about how to become a child of God. In John chapter 1, we read, whoever believed on the name of Jesus had the right to become a child of God. And in John 3:16, that whoever believes in him can be born again. You become like a child of God. And Romans teaches that when you have saving faith in Christ, you're adopted as a child. So he is not saying if you become a peacemaker, then you'll be a child of God. What he's saying is that the children of God, as they increasingly become like God, are peacemakers. And let me show you what this life of blessedness looks like. In fact, the word that is usually translated blessed here is not the usual word for blessed. In fact, this is a Greek word that is more like happy. Or it actually, to be more precise, it is a word that really is what the Greeks would use to speak of someone who ought to be congratulated. It is like saying, it's really kind of like saying, are you a peacemaker? Well, congratulations. You're one of the happiest, most blessed, and well-off people there must be then. It's the kind of word that you might use if someone had a healthy newborn baby or got the big promotion at work. Well, congratulations on that. That's what he's saying. Well, he's saying, congratulations to the peacemakers. They shall be called the sons of God. He's not saying that one day later you'll become a child of God. He is saying that the children of God who are filled with the Spirit of God as peacemakers in this world, one day you can count on this in a new heaven and a new earth. Everyone will look at you and go, oh, that is a child of God. And as we launch this whole series, I've just been thinking about Jesus. This is a complex issue to think about being a peacemaker, and I want to just give you today some broad principles that I see, I think, as the backdrop of the idea of blessed are the peacemakers, and it's taken really from thinking about Jesus' own life. Just three. We could mention many, but there's three different ways that I see this in Jesus' own life, and I think it's reflected in any peacemakers. And the first is this, that peacemakers like Jesus have a Holy Spirit infused capacity to gain a skill, really, of being able to disagree without being needlessly disagreeable, and not needlessly adding to strife, but being a vessel through which strife can be calmed. And this is something that Jesus just did on a regular basis. I got thinking about the most famous feud of all time, the Hatfields and the McCoys. Did a little research on them. The McCoy family, hailed from Ireland, were led by Randolph McCoy, the grandson of the patriarch William McCoy, and the McCoys lived mainly on the Kentucky side of Tug Fork, a tributary of Big Sandy River. The Hatfield family lived on the West Virginia side of the river, and they were led by William Anderson Hatfield, who was known as Devil Anse Hatfield. Well, when Asa Harmon McCoy, who fought for the Union in the Civil War, came home, he was murdered by a group of Confederate home guards that called themselves the Logan Wildcats. Now, though Devil Anse Hatfield was blamed for it and accused of the crime, it was later proven that he didn't do it because he was sick at home during the time of the murder. So nobody really knows who it was that committed that first crime and killed Asa McCoy. The whole feud started over the assumption that the leader of the Hatfields had done it, but then later we realized nobody actually knew that that's what happened at all. Nobody really knows, therefore. Well, 13 years later, in 1878, a dispute emerged about the ownership of a hog. Yes, a hog. Floyd Hatfield, cousin of Devil, had a hog in his possession, but Randolph McCoy claimed it was his, saying that the markings on the pig's ears were McCoy marks, not Hatfield marks. And so they took the matter to the justice of the peace, who happened to be a Hatfield, and he ruled, of course, in favor of the Hatfields, which didn't do any good for the ill will. And a witness who was a relative named Bill Statton was then later killed by two McCoy brothers, and they were later acquitted on grounds of self-defense. This feud violence went on for about 30 years. And it's the measure of what all feuds ever have been, and that is if you're in one clan, then you have to hate everything about the other clan, and if you're in the other clan, you have to hate everything about the other. That's how silly it is. Interestingly, many years later, I read that the descendants of the McCoys and Hatfields were invited to a week-long competition in 1979 on the TV game show Family Feud. He played for a cash prize and a pig that was kept on stage during the entire competition. The things that people are feuding about now, they might be laughing about later with a pig on the stage. A feud. As I've been reading some about the dynamics of polarization in preparation for this series, there are many things I might highlight along the way. But I want to first note this. Interestingly, when it comes to political ideologies in America, most people are still moderates. On a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is one extreme and 10 the other, most people are 4, 5s, and 6s. That hasn't really changed. But something has changed dramatically, and that is that the members of one party today are far more likely to adhere to every part of the party line, every one of the main issues that their party holds, whereas it used to be somebody might be Republican, but they believe some of the things Democrats believe. Or somebody might be Democrat and they believe some of the things Republicans believe. And that has changed dramatically. The other thing that has changed really, really dramatically is just how much bad feeling there is towards someone who has a different ideology. There is a measure of polarization that sociologists speak of called affective polarization. Affective, meaning how you feel, positively or negatively they feel about something. So if you ask someone to rate, how they feel about an institution, you might say, okay, if 1 is the coldest and 100 is the warmest feeling, how do you feel about the Fox News, or how do you feel about CNBC, or how do you feel about Apple products, or how do you feel about, and they'll do surveys and ask people about this, and if they absolutely are cold towards it, they're a 1, and if they're very, very warm, it'd be 100. Well, over the years, Democrats and Republicans, when asked how they feel about their own party, generally have come in and said around about a warm 70 or so. And that hasn't really changed, so a pretty warm number there. And up until the 1990s, people reported that when they were asked how they felt about the other party, that they'd give a pretty cool score, averaging about 40. But what's changed is that since the 1990s, though people still have about the same warmth, 70, towards their own party, they now report on average that they feel towards the other party about a 10. In other words, very, very cold. In other words, something has happened wherein it's becoming more and more likely that people would think that someone with a different ideology from theirs, that they are going to disagree with everything with that person. I'm just saying this because something happens anytime that the Hatfields and the McCoys start hating each other. And then Jesus came. And he came into a highly polarized world, of course, when you think of the Roman Empire and the oppression against those that weren't Roman citizens. But even within the people of faith, those Jesus came into as one of the Jewish people, there was this very polarized kind of feud, really, between the religious leaders, Pharisees and other religious leaders, who essentially saw themselves as the ones who were right, and everyone else that didn't do everything that they said was wrong. And so you could almost say that it was between the ones they called the sinners and the religious leaders. And so here came Jesus, who was identified as a rabbi, and they would expect him to therefore be in the camp with the religious leaders, who would look down on everything within the sinner group. But instead, Jesus had friends in both. And in fact, it was scandalous because Jesus was known as the friend of sinners. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So he began disrupting the whole system. And so, in other words, if you want to be a peacemaker, I think the first thing that's Christ-like that you must do is refuse to be in a feud. And by that, I don't mean that you find a way to not disagree with other people. You're going to disagree with other people. But you find a way that you are escaping the trap of polarization, wherein it is some sort of rule that because you disagree on something substantive with another person, that therefore you got to disagree with everything, meaning that you then don't have any points of agreement whatsoever. And when you get this kind of Christ heart towards this, you start shattering some of the categories. And what this does is it allows you to still disagree, but to not be needlessly disagreeable. But instead, what happens is relationships and opportunities for the love of God to shine forth come where we are building on points of agreement. And we can't do that if we have already judged that there is nothing about this person or this group that I could be at all open to, you see. But God moves through power of agreement. He's not a God of strife. He is a God of clarity and singleness of truth, yes, but he is wonderful in the way that he connects. That's what Jesus did. It's astounding. So throughout sabbatical, I have been studying, I've been writing, I've had some family time, but for the last week and a half to 2 weeks, Ann and I took one of the most delicious trips that we have been on since our honeymoon. We just got in the car and we drove into the cool. And we went and stayed in some of the loveliest bed and breakfasts in Vermont. I'd never been to Vermont, and found us some 70-degree temperatures and chilly nights and beautiful places and some of the best meals. It was just absolutely wonderful. And we would just ride around from inn to inn and uncrowded highways in Vermont. And here's what we did for hours. Look at that view, honey. Oh, wow. Aren't those mountains beautiful? See the way that they roll, so green, the green mountains of Vermont. That's beautiful, isn't it? Oh, it is beautiful. I love that. Look over here, there's a covered bridge. One of Vermont's covered bridges that they're famous for. Oh, that's great. Oh, let's stop. Take a picture of that. Here, let's get a selfie in front of the bridge. Isn't that quaint? Isn't that wonderful? Look at this quaint village. We're going to stop. We're going to spend some time here. Look, listen, taste this sample of this cheddar cheese that they're making here. Isn't that is delicious? Yes, honey, that is good. Yes. In other words, we're just riding around, agreeing on the beauty. Now, the truth of the matter is that it's possible at any given point to not agree, isn't it? I mean, my wife could say, as we walk through a quaint village going in and out of shops, she could say, "Isn't this fun?" Which she did say. And I could say, "I'd rather be playing golf." I could say, "Isn't that a beautiful green mountain?" And she could say, "Well, they're all green. I've gotten tired of them now." She could say, "Isn't this the prettiest brook babbling along the side of the highway where we're driving?" And I could say, "Well, I've seen better at Yosemite." We could at any given point decide to disagree with one another, couldn't we? But I spent about 11 days just spending hours after hours with the radio off and talking to my wife and looking at beautiful things and agreeing upon how beautiful it all and how wonderful it was and how good God is and thinking about all those things. And when we got back, we went to lunch for the end of sabbatical. And I said, "I've written down some things that God has shown me in the light, and I don't want to forget it when the darkness comes. I've got some things I've got clarity about, and I want to talk to you about it. There's some goals I've set in my life, and there's some revelations I have I want to share." And she said, "I want to do the same thing." So we sat down at lunch, and we shared some things that we'd learned. And then we got to the end of the lunch, and she said, "There's one more thing I want to share with you." And this was a problem. And it was something that involved me changing some. And I felt just a little seed of that thing come up, that comes up in your heart. You know what I'm talking about? Where it's like somebody tells you there's something they'd like to see change, and the first response is within you is to get defensive about it and say, "Well, let me tell you something that you ought to change. And I thought we were talking about our own goals, and now and I felt it's just a little seed of it try to come up, but it couldn't find root. You know why? Because I just spent 11 days agreeing with her on so many beautiful things. And I'm just saying there's something about the Holy Spirit who, while never deviating from the crystal clarity of the truth of the gospel, of course, He is the truth, the Holy Spirit loves to build bridges. God didn't come and save you because He agreed with you. You're running away from Him, and the whole world was at enmity with God. And He came to build a bridge to you. There's something wonderful that happens when the Holy Spirit gets hold of you and you get more like Jesus, who astoundingly had occasion after occasion to be able to point out all the things He disagreed with, and so often He just didn't. John 6:15, perceiving they were about to come and take Him by force to make Him king, a political king. He didn't want any of it. Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by Himself. Matthew 12:14. The Pharisees went out, conspired against him, how to destroy him. And Jesus was aware of this, and it would have been a great opportunity for him to tell them every single thing that he disagreed with. But instead he withdrew from there, and many followed him. And healed them, and he ordered them not to make them known yet. And in Matthew 22, famously, tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They tried to trap him, but Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. And he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him, and they went away. There are many complexities to this. Obviously, there are times in which Jesus directly confronted evil. Obviously, there are times but I just want to point out that Jesus didn't spend his ministry going around trying to be needlessly disagreeable. He built bridges even to those that the world called sinners. And we can do the same. In as much as is possible with you, live peaceably with all people. Here's the second thing I notice about Jesus' life, and I think is foundational as we start talking about being peacemakers, and that is that peacemakers spend more time pointing toward what we are for than pointing out what we don't like about others. And this is huge. Again, Jesus did have times, especially with the religious hypocrites, that he directly pointed out what was wrong with them. But throughout most of his ministry, Jesus was essentially living in such a way that people would see the love of God in him, the Son of God. What I'm saying is that I want to spend my life, and I want to invite you in this polarized culture to spend your energy primarily pointing to what we're for. Pointing passionately, excitedly, gloriously to the goodness of God, to the love of God in Jesus Christ and what we're for. And to be famous for what we're for. And to have people expect it. That's what we're going to be, is pointing to what we're for. So, highlight of sabbatical and highlight of our up north trip. We kept driving. We went to New Hampshire. We said, well, we're up here. Let's go into Canada. We went to Quebec City. And it's like old Europe almost. And it was so fun getting lost when the GPS quit working on the back roads of French-speaking Quebec and having no map. And but we spent several days there in Quebec, and I didn't know till we got there was a brochure that you could drive another nearly 3 hours north to Bay St. Catherine. And from there you could catch a boat and go out and see whales, potentially. And I don't know why, I just became alive with it. It was one of those things I've just always dreamt of doing. I want to see a whale in the wild. And I can't believe I talked Ann into doing it. She said she'd do it. We went and talked to the concierge at our hotel and said, tell us about that. She said, well, there are two different boats. She said, one is a small rubber boat you can get in, and they say you can get closer to the whales in it. And she said, I said, how is it? She said, it's wonderful. She said, I did it last year. She said, in fact, at one point we felt a whale come up and felt the back of the whale go under our rubber boat. My wife said, tell me about the other boat. And I did too. The other boat was bigger. It had a bathroom and snacks on it. And we opted for the bigger boat. And we rode out about an hour, and first in French and then in English. The guide said, now don't assume that you're going to necessarily see a whale because this is not a zoo, and we don't make them appear. But we're going to take you, we're going to hope for this. Well, I rented some binoculars, and we're just out, we're looking, nothing. I thought, we've come up here all the way to Bay St. Catherine, there's no whales. And I'm looking through binoculars, and I'm pretty sure that I saw the spout of a whale in the distance through the binoculars. I said, honey, I think I saw one. And of course, she didn't see it. And then a little while later, she goes, ooh, I think I just saw one. And I didn't see it because I had the binoculars fixed somewhere else. And then nothing for a long time. I thought, we're not going to see a single whale. That was it. But then, as we trolled on out further, all of a sudden our guide starts hollering into the microphone, 2 o'clock, and we look. And there was the spout blowing of a fin whale, the second largest whale in the world. And we got right close and saw this majestic creature rolling out of the water. They live for hundreds of years and grow up to 60 feet long. It's the second largest living creature in the world. And we saw as many as 10 fin whales. And then we saw humpback mother whale and her baby. And we saw them spout and roll out and put their tails up above the water into the, and I'm having a glory fit when I see the tail. And we've got people on this boat of all kinds of nationalities and different walks of life. And guess what? On a whale watching boat, there is no strife. Because how can you spend your time arguing with your neighbor when one of the biggest creatures in the world is on the starboard side of your boat? You can't. And so what you do is you just point. If you see a whale, there's one over there. And everybody on the boat starts running over to this side to look and see the great sight. I think peacemakers are those that just point at the greatness and glory and beauty of God and worry a little less about whether they fixed everybody else's views in the process. You'd be amazed the transformation that can come if you just love everybody always. Which leads me to a final point. Of all the books I read on sabbatical, my favorite was Bob Goff's recent book, Everybody Always. Just a nourishing, well-written book about a man who's living a radical life for God. And in that book, he tells about his son who, after college, this son of his just loved to do wild and dangerous things. His son Adam, who he said, if you can't lose your arm doing it, Adam's not interested in it. So Adam started taking skydiving lessons, not the tandem lessons where you just get strapped on with a pro who then pulls the chute for you and all that, but solo skydiving, which requires a lot of on-ground training and then multiple jumps where a professional is free-falling next to you to make sure you don't panic and lose it. And Adam got there every weekend. This is what he was doing. And Bob Goff would go and watch his son skydive. He said he'd always wished his son would play soccer or something like that, pull for him to score a goal rather than having to sit there and watch him jump out of a plane from 12,000 feet and hope that he pulls his chute and doesn't forget. Well, Bob Goff said that he decided to just blow Adam's mind. And without Adam knowing it, Bob, the dad, went and took skydiving lessons himself. Because if his son loved doing it, he wanted to be with him. And so he took him over to the airport. And as Adam got out and pulled his parachute, started making his way towards the plane, Bob Goff reached in the trunk, pulled out his own parachute, started walking with him. And Adam looked at his dad and said, "What are you doing, Dad?" And he said, he just winked back at him and said, "Well, how hard can it be?" Got onto the airplane in his parachute, and when the green light came on, it was time to jump. He was remembering that the way he was trained was to roll up on your toes so everyone knows that you're about to jump, then crouch down and then jump. So up and down and out. And Adam was the first to go up and down and then out and did a backflip, of course, for show. And it was then the dad's turn. He came to the edge, and he's supposed to go up and down and out, and he abandoned that whole thing. And instead, he just jumped. Listen to what he said. "I'm not really sure what overcame me in the moment," Goff writes, "but there was a massive jolt of adrenaline and an overwhelming desire to be with Adam in the air as he fell. I sprang to the door, blew off all the up, down, and out stuff, and threw myself out of the plane with everything I had. I jumped so hard, I jumped right out of my tennis shoes. No joke. Try doing that sometime. It's not easy, but it's what it looks like to want to be with someone that bad. I was free falling in my socks and laughed when I realized what I'd done. And after a long minute of free falling, I reached behind me, pulled on the hacky sack, the parachute came out, and I landed in a field near Adam. He pretended he didn't know me as I walked in my socks over to the airplane after it landed to get my tennis shoes back. I know, he writes a little bit more now, what it feels like to be a father who wants to be with his kids. Jesus did something a lot like that. He jumped out of heaven to be with us. I think my final point is that peacemakers just seem to care a lot more about relationship than they do about being right. And God, disagreeing with everything in the sinful world except the fragments of his own glory, came to be with us, God Emmanuel, and put on flesh like we have to be with us. So this neighbor who's not connected with our church at the Weldon Village pre-Independence Day party starts talking to this angry woman. And the woman says, will you just come over to my house and you'll hear it for yourself? And so she did and was gone 45 minutes. And when she came back, a woman not even connected with our church, she came back with a calm woman who was no longer angry and said to her, listen, enjoy the rest of the evening with us. And next year when we do this, come have a hamburger and a hot dog with us. And the one who was on the outside was put on the inside. And the woman came over and shook Pastor Barrett's hand. I'm not saying that every strife-filled situation that has potential to grow into a Greensboro massacre will do so. But I'm just saying that the watershed towards the pinnacle, the peacemaker and the strife inducer might not look that different, but boy, by the time that it runs down to their oceans, one is the seed of death and one is the seed of life. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And that's the gospel.